This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal, medical, or mental health advice. The views and opinions expressed do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the podcast and are not intended to malign any religion, group, club, organization, business, individual, anyone, or anything.
I'm Sarah Edmondson.
And I'm Anthony Nippy Ames, and this is A Little Bit Culty.
We woke up from a cult, and that journey was captured in The Vow on HBO and in my memoir, Scarred.
Now, in this podcast, we break down the shame and secrets that make these experiences so destructive with honest conversations on how seemingly benign groups can cross into the cultiverse and how to spot and recover from trouble if it happens to you.
Each week, we bring in experts, survivors, and whistleblowers to explore red flags, resilience, and even share a few laughs, because sometimes you gotta laugh.
Subscribe to our Patreon for early and ad-free listening, some live Q&A, and exclusive content at patreon.com/alittleBitCulty.
Welcome to Season 8 of A Little Bit Culty. Welcome back, everybody, to part 2 with Josh Paddison. I know you've all been just dying to know what this first salacious sex cult story actually was at Fountain Grove in Santa Rosa, California. Tell us all about it. What happened? What did Chevalier find there? Here's what's important, Josh. Normally we have a survivor story. We can't do that here. You're going to represent her journey. She went in because she was a seeker and she wanted to grow, and she heard about this great mystic. What were some of the red flags that she saw along the way that she would later realize were indications of something nefarious going on?
So she spent the summer of 1891 in Santa Rosa with Harris and his followers. And there were about 30 total followers at Fountain Grove at the time. And she saw some things that started to trouble her. She saw that Harris would spend the day dictating poems in his office or his library while everybody else in the colony would do physical labor. And this was typical of Harris's colonies that he had established in New York and now in California. And she saw that there were these wealthy white women who were followers of Harris, and they were spending all day, doing very difficult physical labor like laundry and helping print Harris's poetry. He had his own printing press, or working in the vineyard. And she saw that, and that kind of troubled her ideas of what, kind of middle-class women should be doing. And then she saw a couple other things that made her eyebrows raise. She saw at one point Jane Lee Harris, who was the kind of manager of Fountain Grove, one of Harris's followers. She saw Harris sitting with his feet in her lap, which she took note of. And we should mention that Harris claimed to be celibate, right? His movement claimed to be celibate. He said that you needed to refrain from sex to ultimately reach the highest spiritual places. And he boasted in interviews that very few children had been born at his colonies, which he used as evidence to show that, people weren't having sex. So she saw a couple things. She didn't see much that really bothered her, but there were a couple of moments with Harris where she kind of resented his tone. And he said at one point that he wanted her to go back to the Eastern United States and become his queen of the East and become his kind of prophet speaking to other people in the East. And she didn't like that. She didn't want to be under his authority. So she pushed back at that. And he had this idea of counterparts. And this would be very important in the sex scandal, because his idea of counterparts was that everybody had a soulmate. And this was a common idea among spiritualists, right? The term soulmate comes from spiritualism, the idea that you have one other person on earth that you are perfectly matched with. But Harris, unlike most spiritualists, claimed that your counterpart was a spirit in heaven. And so you were invited by Harris to discover your counterpart and have sex with your counterpart. So you were not supposed to have sex here on earth, but you could have sex with your counterpart. And Harris had a counterpart bride named Lily Queen, and he claimed to have children with her who lived in heaven. And we have really interesting primary sources from some of his followers where they talk about being visited by their counterpart. And they talk about it as a shivering ecstasy that goes through your whole body as the spirit is communing with you. So he informed Chevalier that she had a counterpart. And she said, well, how will I feel him? How will I know him? And he told her, well, you'll feel him in your toes. And she didn't quite like the tone of that. That was a little too physical, I think, for her to accept. So there were a couple things that happened in that summer that made her push back a little bit against Harris. But when she left Fountain Grove, she still was praising Harris. And she gave an interview where she said that his followers were all pious people. And she had a lot of praise for him until a little bit further into 1891. A man who she called Mr. X to keep him anonymous, Mr. X came with some affidavits. And the affidavits claimed that there were all kinds of unspeakable sexual practices happening at Fountain Grove. And Mr. X had been collecting these affidavits, and he'd been interviewing ex-members, apostates, ex-members of Fountain Grove and ex-members of Harris's New York colonies. And he had these affidavits, and he gave them to Chevalier, and she read them and she believed them.
And just to be clear, like an affidavit is just a signed letter, correct?
Exactly. You go before a judge and you make a statement that you've sworn to be true.
Well, I imagine it confirmed some of her suspicions too, which then led her to do what?
I think so. I think that it confirmed some of the things that she saw that had troubled her. She said many times to the press when she began her campaign to destroy Fountain Grove that she did not see anything sexual personally. And I think she kind of had to say that because when she starts to go out into the press and go out and give public lectures denouncing Harris and attacking Fountain Grove, she needed to keep herself safe from the accusations that she was making against Harris because they could so easily be thrown back at her because she was talking about sex in the public forum. And for a woman in 1891, to be doing that was a dangerous effort. So she emphasized again and again that she didn't see anything sexual at Fountain Grove. I do wonder a little about how much of that was a strategic decision because she needed to make sure that she was on the side of purity because she was going into the public realm and attacking Harris.
So optically, it's purity versus evil.
Exactly.
Okay.
Which even in 2017, when we went public, like that was something that I was aware of as a whistleblower of like, you know, I didn't see this, but this is what's happening according to people that have been there. And even though I don't have the same connection with purity by any way, shape, or form, I don't want to be linked to the harem. Do you know what I mean?
Right,
So
for sure.
I totally get that.
Also, you know, when this stuff came out for us, things made sense. Secrecy made sense. His caginess made sense. So I can imagine when you get someone coming to you with actual evidence, you connect the dots on your own. And then for us, I think it was pretty clear to like, okay, here's how we
including
get
feet
out of
in
this.
lap,
Yeah.
like things like that.
Juxtaposed with the behavior of trying to pretend you're celibate seems to be like you're protesting an image that you're hiding for me, you know. So anyhow, I imagine those behaviors are similar in 1890 and 2017. So
I think you're right. I think the kinds of pressures that Chevalier faced and feared haven't gone away. Absolutely.
And since nothing's changed and the audience wants a salacious story, can you tell us a little bit about some of the things? I mean, we kind of skimmed over, there was accusations of group bathing, for example.
Yeah.
They all bathed each other. Like, what was going on as far as you know?
well, suffice to say they're siloed,
Yeah.
right?
So Chevalier made some pretty explosive claims. And as the scandal went on, she kind of kept upping how much detail she would give because it was this kind of a game she had to play, right? She wanted to shock and get attention towards stopping this man, but she feared going too far and being accused of corrupting the public herself. So she kind of would make references to things and then maybe then a couple weeks later she'd give more details. But ultimately what she said was going on in Fountain Grove was co-ed bathing, the idea that they would all bathe together, men and women, sex between members of Fountain Grove, including between older women and younger men and older men and younger women, Harris himself having sex with different members of the colony, people going mad because of the sexual jealousy and psychodramas that were going on, and that when women became pregnant, they would pound on their abdomens to induce abortion.
Wow.
Ugh. So was it ever revealed, or do you have a sense of like how this sex with counterparts occurred? Is it revealed that Harris is actually like, get in my bed and then you'll have sex with your counterpart? It's not me, but like, what's the logistics of this?
Right. So that was what Chevalier said, was that this counterpart ideology was nothing more than a way to mask free love. That you would have sex with your counterpart because your counterpart would inhabit someone's body. So therefore it wasn't, adultery or free love. It was this sexual ecstasy with your true counterpart. They just happened to be in Harris's body, and to have sex with your counterpart, you had to have sex with Harris. That was the accusation, that the counterpart was a corrupt ideology to serve the sexual desires of Harris.
That's a racket.
That is a racket. This is, by the way, if ever people have been listening to our podcast for a while, this is the precursors also to Twin Flames, the Twin Flames cult, which I'm sure you've been following. Find your soulmate.
Yep.
So again, preying on people's most deepest desires for love and connection and spirituality, all wrapped up. Okay, so she leaves, exposing a fountain grove. Tell us a little bit about Harris's response to her, which I think is fascinating.
Yeah, so when Chevalier launches this campaign, it's very aggressive. It immediately gets widespread newspaper coverage. Joseph Pulitzer's New York World picks up immediately, and she writes a piece for that. She's writing for the San Francisco Chronicle. She's giving public lectures. Harris, even before it starts, is launching a counterattack, and he knows how to do it. He's a powerful, wealthy man in Santa Rosa. He's got friends in high places locally in Santa Rosa because has this very successful vineyard. So he's a member of the Knights Templar, which is a fraternal organization. So he's got lots of powerful friends. He's friends with the newspaper editor in Santa Rosa, and he's got these international followers who are there ready to defend him.
Scientology. Sorry.
So they attack Chevalier. They claim that she's the one that's impure, that she's imagining all this, that she's making it up, that she is nothing more than a traveling prostitute who wanted to seduce Harris. And when she failed, she launched this attack, and it was all a bunch of lies, and that she was a bad woman who was herself corrupting the public, and which is an effective way to attack a woman in this moment.
For particularly when you don't have language to articulate the abuse of Harris, and you're going up against powerful men that are aligned with him. She seems to be a one-person army.
Yeah, she marshaled the defenses she could, but Harris had a lot of advantages. He was a white, wealthy man, and, he could use the press to his advantage. And so he started to print up these mimeographs that had his letters and accusations, and then they would make their way into the press. And so he started to insinuate that she was insane, that she'd spent time in a mental institution. I think that's not accurate. I'm not 100% sure on that, but he was definitely insinuating that she was mentally ill. And he had ways of getting these messages put into the press, and then it gets picked up by other media. And Chevalier was out there by herself. She had her mother who would write pieces, and she occasionally had someone who would write a letter of support for her. But yes, she was out there by herself.
A couple of things that I see as parallels. One was the question from, okay, if this is true, this is something that we faced as well, because we got, high up within the organization. When we left and we were called suppressive and we were called all these terrible things, the thought was like, okay, if we are so bad, how did we get so high up in the organization? How did Keith Raniere miss that we were not good people to be in line with next to him? So the same thing was asked of Chevalier. How did he misjudge her, right? How did he let her in if she was such a wanton harlot or whatever?
Yes, that was a question that his followers had to face. And they said that he was too chivalrous, that he'd brought her in to help her, and he wanted to learn more about Christian Science and mental healing. And so his flaw had been he was too generous and too trusting. That's what they said to kind of explain that question, right? Because if you have this pivotal man of creation who is such a wise leader, it does beg that question.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah, if Keith Raniere is so smart, how did he not see the signs that we would eventually take down his organization. Okay, so then what happens?
So, in the middle of this scandal, Harris decides to get married. He marries Jane Lee Waring, who
Ghislaine Maxwell.
is the manager of his colony, his amanuensis, who he dictated all of his poetry to.
She's in her 60s, correct?
Right.
At this
yes.
point. Yeah.
So she's been a member of his colony for decades at this point, and they decide to get married, which is an odd thing. And in fact, Harris has been married 3 times, which may be surprising for a celibate individual to be married that many times. But he does reassure his followers that this marriage is not a sexual matter, that he's still married only to Lily Queen, his spiritual bride. But he marries Jane Lee Waring and decides to leave the country. And this is kind of how ultimately the scandal will end, is that he decides he's got to leave. There's enough accusations swirling around. There's enough threats of violence or arrest swirling around that he is scared ultimately where this will go. And so he leaves the country after marrying her. And this is where we need to talk about the term cult, because it is starting to be used in the media in this moment. The term cult prior to the 1890s did not mean what it means today. The term cult really had a very neutral meaning and just meant devotion or veneration. So you don't see the modern negative connotations of that word cult until the 1890s. And it's actually during the sex scandal that you start to see this word cult used more and more to describe Harris. Harris wasn't the only person that the word cult was used to describe, but he was the central and main person who, I believe, helped establish that term in the public consciousness as we understand it today. Chevalier never used that word cult, but you start to see it in the news coverage. The Harris cult, the Fountain Grove cult. And that word takes on the modern meanings that we know of it today, right? An authoritarian leader who is hypnotizing or brainwashing his followers, for his own sexual and financial gain. That people who are in a cult are being brainwashed and victimized, right? This idea is being born out of Chevalier's charges and out of the media coverage that it's garnering.
Let's take a break from the cultiverse. Here's a word from our sponsors. Thanks for listening, everyone. Now let's dive back into the cultiverse.
So up until now, when the word is neutral, what were some of the other, how were people villainizing these types of communes and alternatives to more mainstream Christianity? Have you used the word fanaticism, or what was the terminology to portray that people believe there was some con involved?
So earlier you would see words like enthusiast, fanatic, prophet, messiah. These are the kinds of words that would converge in the cult leader in the 1890s.
Would those put up red flags, or there was charged words, and cult kind of encapsulated all those?
Yes, those were charged words that would carry a lot of the same connotations, but the cult and the cult leader just crystallizes it into this immediately understood concept. And it's so interesting how similar the 1890s cult is to the way we use it today. It's like the concept was born fully formed in a way that's immediately recognizable to us today.
And what's your understanding as a historian of how that maybe changed or maybe went away a little bit and then reemerged, perhaps, from my understanding as a non-historian, in the 70s with Jim Jones?
We're sitting on.
Yeah, where did it go and when did it come back? And maybe might be a good time to speak a little bit about the controversy with religious scholars.
So the term cult, once it emerges, becomes very widely used. And from the beginning, California was associated with cults. So maybe we can come back to that part of the story.
I'd love to.
Yeah. But yeah, so once the term cult emerges, it becomes widely used. And so you see 1910s, 1920s, there's a lot of cult activity. There's a lot of media concern about cults. It doesn't really entirely go away, but it has a new emphasis in the public mind in the 1960s and 1970s, probably culminating at Jonestown, right? 1978. That's really when there's a cult scare that's happening, which will very easily flow right into the satanic panic of the 1980s, right? That's when there's widespread concern about cults, and there's the birth of the anti-cult industry, which is a lot of them were parents who'd seen children go into these kinds of movements in the 1970s, some of whom had children that had died, and they were responsible for starting the modern anti-cult movement. And a lot of this was done in California. And then the term will continue on, of course, in the 21st century and have a long life. In terms of the word cult, right, I do use it advisedly because from the beginning, right, my own work shows that it was an epithet used to demonize groups that were outside the mainstream, right? It was a product of the media. It was a product of yellow journalism. It carried all these negative connotations. Nobody, as far as I know, has ever joined a cult, right, in their own mind, right? Nobody calls their mom and says, I joined a cult, because that term is so negative. Right. So scholars, religious studies, and in history, especially after the cult scare of the 1970s, we've become very careful about that word because of all of these negative connotations. So that's why you see terms like new religious movement, right? So you sometimes will see terms like marginalized religions or outsider religions or small religions or non-mainstream, right? There's like all these kind of ways to try to get at it without replicating some of the anti-cult discourse ourselves when we're trying to objectively study groups that are outside the Protestant norm.
Yeah, also it does marginalize a group intentionally or unintentionally when you say cult. I mean, assumptive in calling something a cult, to your point, is you don't call up your mom and say, I joined a cult, but there is coercive activity. And I think ultimately, if you can try and get that across without alienating people by saying it's a cult, or people saying it's a cult and dismissing the fact that they could be susceptible to the coercion of it, is what happens. Because when I hear cult, it's normally too late. Someone's been coerced, and the person probably studying it thinks, oh, it's a cult. That would never happen to me. So it
has its pros and cons.
Yeah, it has positive and negative connotations to it, right?
Yes. And because we're being careful about our terminology doesn't mean we want to whitewash the sometimes abusive histories of these groups, right? I mean, that's something that I had to really wrestle with.
Which are case by case.
Case. And I really had to wrestle with that with this book because on one hand, I was aware that this term cult is doing a lot of work. It's doing a lot of damage in terms of how you negatively portray a group. On the other hand, right, there are a lot of religious groups in which leaders take advantage of their followers. There's a lot of groups that do have sexual abuse. There's a lot of groups that do have violence. There's a lot of groups that are apocalyptic. So I think we want to not excuse that kind of behavior. I'm not an apologist for Harris. I'm not an apologist for any of these groups that coerce, that abuse, that take advantage of people. A lot of religions also engage in that kind of stuff. There's been a lot of religious leaders that take advantage of, right? Yeah. It's not just cult leaders. The biggest, in fact. Absolutely.
Yeah. When we got out of our cult and needed to use that word to sound the alarm, is obviously very useful to us. But at the same time, as we step back from it, realize that using the word, there's pros and cons. It's not black and white. And I think that's when we were educating ourselves and realizing, there's this whole history with the religious scholars and the anti-cultists. And even that is black and white thinking. It's not one or the other. You can have a new religious movement that's also abusing people and doing these terrible things. And ironically, and I think you'll, not only as a historian, but as a teacher, I think you'll get a kick out of this, that in Nexium, in our very first 5-day training, there was a class, a module, we called it, where we learned about the word cult and that people would undoubtedly call us a cult because it's different than what everyone else is doing, because we are, waking up to this new reality and it's going to be different and we're not going to respond in the same way when we leave the class and people are going to say we're in a cult, which knocks us down at our knees because it's not saying what bad specifically we are doing, which is actually a really good point.
Well, they wouldn't know because they didn't take the training.
Well, and we'd say, they wouldn't know what we're doing because they didn't take the training and they're just looking online, which is, not a good source of evidence. But the point is that I remember Nancy Salzman teaching this on the video, saying, if we were murdering people, then we would say that we were murderers. If we were stealing from people, we'd say we were thieves. If we were, what were some of the other things, Nippy?
They could pinpoint the
What's
abuse
bad?
of power.
Yeah. So they weren't. So they say, if someone's saying you're a cult, you say, well, what specifically bad thing are we doing? Right. And I think that was good for us until, eventually we saw the bad thing and we could call it out and we could say, these are the bad things that are happening.
Well,
right?
the bad thing that they're doing and what they're doing there is they're actually taking grains of truth.
Yeah.
Right. And using language to obfuscate what they're doing.
Well, also they were hiding what was bad. Like we couldn't see what was bad. Right. So I'm kind of actually leaning away from the word cult these days, even though our podcast is called a little bit culty, but like, what's bad? What is this group doing that's abusive is actually kind of more helpful. That's where I'm at.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. And the word cult does have such power, right? So it makes sense why survivors and apostates who leave these groups would use that term, right? Because it helps you understand your own experience.
Yeah.
Yeah. Which leads me to the question with Harris, do you think all his musings and all his other stuff were kind of a smokescreen to obfuscate what he was really about, which is creating a community obedient to him and at his sexual whim and pleasure? And that's kind of what some people balked at. And he just tried to control that narrative as much as he can with the power that he had. How much of it about what he was doing was that?
I think we need to talk about how true these accusations were for me to be able to answer that. So it's a question I actually didn't want to have to answer when I wrote this book at first, because it's so challenging. And I intended initially when I was researching this book to just kind of lay out the accusations and say, the truth is unknowable. And here's what happened. And I can't tell you exactly whether it's true or not. But as I was researching this book, I decided that was actually irresponsible. I needed, as a scholar, to come down with my opinion, because even if it's challenging, I think it is important, right? It really does color the story. If this is all not true, if they really are just celibate weirdos, then Chevalier is a kind of misguided person who ultimately took down a group that didn't deserve it, right? On the other hand, if he is a cynical, coercive cult leader who is, actually behind the scenes engaging in all of this stuff, then she's a kind of hero, right? So it does really change the story. So I did the most thorough research I could. And ultimately, I go through it in the book. I go through all the evidence and I look at some of the people who left and what they had to say about Harris. And I looked at all the insider primary sources that exist. And ultimately, I can say that there's certain things we know. There was definitely co-ed bathing happening. We have plenty of evidence affirming, even though Harris lied and said they were not, they were bathing together as a group. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that they were coerced into doing so or that anything sexual was happening, but it is for certain that they were engaging in co-ed bathing as a spiritual practice, according to, them. In terms of the sexual stuff, there's a lot of women who felt very uncomfortable around Harris. We have a lot of accounts of people saying Harris touched them in ways that made them feel uncomfortable. He sat too close. He seemed to have an erotic interest in them, not just a fatherly interest in them. And there's several ex-members who we have their accounts that didn't burn up in the fire that do point to some abusive behavior. So I can go so far as to say I do think Harris took advantage of his followers for his own sexual benefit. Now, were they having sex and producing abortions and all the wild ways that Chevalier was saying? I can't go that far. I think some of those probably were exaggerated, but I don't think that ultimately Harris was a responsible leader for his followers. I do think he took advantage of them, both financially and for his own sexual gratification.
The parallels to his behavior and some of the behaviors we witnessed would
point to that.
Yeah.
Even cult podcasts need sponsors. Check out these must-haves. Thank you, sponsors. We couldn't do it without you. Now let's get back to the show. Another little we call them Nexium nerds, our followers who like love these little tidbits. I'd forgotten about this, that when you said that he got married and people were kind of shocked. I don't know if you remember this, Nippy, but after we left and kind of sounded the alarm, there were a number of people who stayed for, I mean, there are people who are still followers, but the people who stayed like just for a few months afterwards to kind of like to see how the organization would handle it. They attended we left in May, June, and then the following August, there was Vanguard Week, which is like his big 10-day celebration. Normally 300, 400 people. I think there was like around 100 or less than 100, the people remaining. And
it's a funeral.
Yeah, everyone was quite bummed out, as you could imagine. And there was a lot of new modules about like, when is it important to be secretive and not secretive? Like there's new education to like reinforce what was happening. Anyway, Keith apparently gets up on stage and announces that he's having a baby with Mariana Fernandez, who's one of the 3 Fernandez sisters that he's had sex with, which we now know to be fact because of the trial, all 3 Fernandez sisters. And Mariana is pregnant with his baby, and they're going to have a baby. And we had people call us that were like, what the fuck? Like he's celibate and now he's having Mariana's baby? And this is
She's having his baby.
Sorry.
That's how that works.
I think it's an important parallel because a lot of times I think these groups have followers that are there and they're like, oh, I mean this and that, and they have maybe their questions, and then something happens and they're like, what? Like a major inconsistency throws them out of the dream. Just thought you'd appreciate that.
There's so many parallels to Harris's story and later groups.
It also seems like if you go down that path and you're lying, your world becomes more narrow and your options become more narrow in terms of like, okay, this person's starting to hold me accountable. This is the behavior that is left for me as an option, right? To at least maintain the facade. Unless I'm going to do something totally like grab a gun and go postal, you have to maintain the facade, pretend that you're not doing anything wrong, and then eventually when things start to close in on you, you have to justify fleeing, create the persona and the facade that maybe you can come back to if you're able to endure it. And that seems to be what Harris did, and that's exactly what Keith did, except there's extradition rules in 2018 that didn't exist in 1896 or whatever it was.
And Harris was never charged with any crimes. And I think that was important because there were other people who would be labeled cult leaders, subsequent to him, who would be arrested for things. And Harris was a step ahead. That could have happened. There's certainly crimes in California, sex crimes on the books in 1892 that he could have been charged with, but he wasn't. And so he was able to go to Wales, which is what happens. He and his new wife go to Wales and they just leave the country, and he never comes back to California. He never returns to Fountain Grove. So Chevalier ends up kind of winning the scandal in that sense, but I think it was not the end that she entirely wanted. The scandal just kind of dissipates. It doesn't come to a final confrontation or there's no climax. He just leaves the country and then she ultimately just abandons her campaign. But then there was a murder investigation. So they teased that.
Oh, that's right.
A few years later, Harris's granddaughter was found dead at Fountain Grove. Harris had children with his first wife before he claimed to be celibate, and one of his granddaughters, named Mary, had died at Fountain Grove. And so this then becomes another round of scandal in which there's speculation that she was murdered or that she'd killed herself because she wanted to avoid having sex with the other members of the colony. And there was an investigation. And ultimately, they found that she had poisoned herself and that she'd taken strychnine and that there was no murder. But there was a lot of media attention to it. This is now 1896, so really at the height of what would be called yellow journalism. And the cult story is established by this point as a very popular genre of newspaper story. The Mary Harris suicide / possible murder becomes kind of an interesting epilogue to the earlier Chevalier scandal.
Do you know that Nexium also has a suicide murder story?
No.
This remains unsolved to this day. Kim Snyder disappeared. There's a suicide note that's apparently not her handwriting in a kayaking incident. And also it was allegedly pregnant with Keith's baby. So unsolved, waiting for someone to take that on as a, unsolved mysteries to find her remains, which would be too much relief to the family that lost Kim Snyder. So anyway, there's so many parallels. It's wild. I'm aware that we have a few minutes left and I'm wondering, do you feel like we covered sort of the main things that people need to know. And this is a very rich book, and I know that
Yeah,
people who
I
want to
think-
dig into it will still get lots out of the book. But in terms of, like, is there anything else that we missed that you feel like would be helpful?
I guess the only other thing to add is that ultimately, as I mentioned, Kanaya Nagasawa, Harris's follower, ends up inheriting the lands of Fountain Grove. And that's something we haven't talked much about, is the fact that there was this racial dimension to the word cult. So many cults of the 1960s and 70s were associated with either Asian religions or Asian leaders or African American groups like Move were called cults. And that kind of racial dimension to the term cult was there from the very beginning as well. So because there were Japanese members of Fountain Grove potentially having sex with white women, that made the story all the more interesting and titillating to readers. And Kanaya Nagasawa's story is fascinating because he inherits these lands ultimately. Harris dies in 1906. These Fountain Grove lands are, like I say, worth billions of dollars today. But California has racist state laws that do not allow Nagasawa to give them to his own heirs. And so the anti-Japanese sentiment of California ends up barring him from passing these lands along. And they end up going to a white farmer who buys the lands and strips Fountain Grove of its history. So it's fascinating to go to Santa Rosa today because they kind of remember Fountain Grove and don't remember it at the same time. There's a Thomas Lake Harris Drive. There is a Fountain Grove Parkway. There's a lot of Fountain Grove named businesses in Santa Rosa today, but people don't remember all of this, scandalous history where in the 1890s, it was all about counterparts and forced intergenerational sex and secret abortions and mixed bathing, right? All that stuff's been forgotten. And today, Fountain Grove just kind of has a feel-good association in Santa Rosa with, I guess, kind of wine and natural spaces, and the actual history of the Fountain Grove colony has mostly been forgotten.
What was it like when you visited?
I have visited 3 times during the research of the book, and yeah, it's so interesting. Unfortunately, a terrible fire burned the entire Fountain Grove area of northern Santa Rosa in 2017. I did visit once before that, so I was able to see some of the collapsed buildings that were still around. There was a round barn that Nagasawa had built that was still standing. All that burned in 2017. So unfortunately, it's very different today if you go to that area of Santa Rosa. But it's very surreal being there and seeing Thomas Lake Harris's name, seeing Fountain Grove everywhere. After reading how scandalous it was back in the 1890s, there's a weird disconnect, a willful forgetting, I think, that the people of Santa Rosa did.
Let's just put that in perspective. That's like going to Clifton Park, Albany, and seeing like Keith Raniere Drive. Just would never happen now. Speaking of
Vanguard Circle.
Saltzman Avenue. So just to wrap up, one final question. So in California, we've got Charles Manson, we have Jim Jones, we have Marshall Applewhite from Heaven's Gate, Charles Diedrich of Synanon. What Father Yod of the Source family?
A lot of flat earthers out there.
A lot of flat earthers, and God knows what's happening there now. What is with California and cultic influence?
Yeah, California was associated with cults from the very beginning of the term's existence. I think partly because of Harris and Fountain Grove helping to establish it. But California, even before the 1890s, has a reputation for innovation, for people who are drawn maybe for the gold rush, who are unusual, who are adventurous, who are innovators, who are wanting to reinvent themselves, right? That kind of risk-taking, innovative spirit that we associate with California Gold Rush, that's always been there. And you also have a lot of Asian immigration to California. You also have, of course, a strong Roman Catholic history in California. So it's always been a place of diversity in terms of religion, and it's always been associated with new ways of doing things. And that predates the term cult, but it would kind of build on itself. And so once it gets established as a place of free thinking and seekers and innovation, then it's going to attract the next generation of people who are moving to California. Like Jim Jones moved to California, right, from Indiana. Harris moved to California from New York. So many of these movements we associate with California didn't start there. They moved there partly because it is known for a place where these kind of places thrive.
It's sort of a promiscuous lawlessness as well. There doesn't seem to be kind of like the stringent laws that maybe might exist on the East Coast. At least that's just my impression.
Or even like
You can buy it.
there's a kind of like when we were doing Nexium
Wild West.
and executive success programs, like we opened a center in LA, and I remember there was this sort of tension between people being very open-minded and open to new things, and at the same time kind of shut down because there were so many cults. Like they were like, is this like Scientology? Like I've
there's
already
a healthy
done like
skepticism.
there was like it was both at the same time.
After 100+ years.
Needless to say, when I discovered California, I was like, wow, my people. I've got green juice and raw bars and yoga. And I was like, yeah, all the things that made me susceptible in terms of being like, kind of crunchy and
Right.
sure.
The left coast, right? Yoga,
Yeah, the left
hippies,
coast.
surfing, right? All of these things that are kind of left wing in a vague way, also breeding grounds for new religions.
Creativity.
So this is very educational for us.
It gave origin to a lot of things.
I really enjoyed reading your book, really enjoyed talking to you. I hope you come to Atlanta one day. Maybe we could meet in person, or maybe we'll come to Texas.
Couple cults around here.
Yeah, there's a few cults.
We found out.
Yeah. Where can people learn more about you or follow up with you and get your book and whatnot?
I don't really have a lot of social media, so the book's available through Oxford University Press. You can also buy it on Amazon and through other booksellers.
Amazing.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Josh. You're a wealth of information.
That was great.
Thank you so much. Really enjoyed talking with you today.
I loved that conversation so much, Nippy. Did you enjoy it?
That could have been a 4-parter if we had gotten into the weeds. If you want to get into the weeds, read the book. It cooks.
It really does. And I do believe it needs to be a series. I have been casting all the characters in my head. In fact, we did so offline with Josh after we were uploading our files.
Amy Adams, Janet Day-Lewis.
It's a whole thing.
Yeah.
Should Trace 120 produce this series? Unholy Sensations?
Can be our next move.
Could be what we do next.
Voila.
Stay tuned. See you next time.
Bye-bye.
A little bit culty.
Sinking down to the depths of the ocean, hanging on to the wave of my love. If I let go of it all, I could leave, but I know I won't.
We hope you're enjoying A Little Bit Culty. If so, please do show us some love. Drop a rating or leave a review. Hit subscribe on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you listen. And subscribe to our Patreon at patreon.com/alittlebitculty.
Even better, send this episode to someone who needs it. Maybe they're in a cult. Maybe they're just a little bit susceptible. Or maybe they just love a good story. Spread the word, spread the love. Thanks for listening, and see you next time.
A Little Bit Culty is a Trace 120 production.
Executive produced by Sarah Edmondson and Anthony Nippy Ames in collaboration with producer Will Rutherford at Citizens of Sound. Our co-creator is Jess Temple Tardy.
Our production coordinator is Leslie Dinsmore.
Writing by Sandra Namoto and social media marketing by Eric Swarzinski and Brooke Keene.
Our theme song, Cultivated, is by the artists John Bryant and Nigel Aslan.